So eschatology, what is that all about? It derives from the Greek word. Most of our theological words come from Greek or Latin. And it's from eschatos, which means last, referring to time, and ology, whenever you've got ology, that's knowledge or the study of. So eschatology is the study of the last days. So it's really a big word for prophecy, eschatology. Now, especially in the Pentecostal and charismatic circles, a lot of people aren't exposed to the beliefs of others. And so often you find that the predominant debate in Pentecostal and charismatic circles is around the timing of the rapture, but without realizing that there's actually even a broader sort of a view of eschatology. And so when it comes to the timing of Bible prophecy, there are three different views. The one is futurism. Thanks. There's preterism, historicism. I cover these in a lot more detail in my books if you're interested in knowing more, and it's not too overwhelming. But we'll see what that means now. I put futurism in green because that is the view that's held to by most charismatic / Pentecostals. Okay, the timing of the rapture. The rapture, some people say that it's before the tribulation, which is a view I hold. Some say it's in the middle of the 7-year tribulation. Others say it's at the end of the tribulation. That's a debate that most people are aware of. And then the timing of the millennium. The millennium is a 1,000-year period where Christ rules. And we hold to the view of premillennialism, which means there'll be a literal millennium, 1,000 years in the future when Christ reigns literally on earth. But you also get the view amillennialism, which is held by the Catholic Church and some of the Reformed movements, and also post-millennialism. But we'll get into that later. So looking at the three main views regarding the timing of prophecy in general. Preterism. Now, this is a relatively recent view. When I say recent, I'm talking in terms of hundreds of years, but it certainly was something that was unknown to the early church. They hold that most of the prophecies in Revelation, for example, and Daniel, are already fulfilled. And they were fulfilled in the 1st century after Christ, most of them at 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. So effectively, if you're a preterist, when you read Revelation and Daniel, you're not reading prophecy, you're reading history. Historicism, they say that prophecies in the Bible are fulfilled gradually over the history of the church age. So in the 2,000 years since Jesus, they'll take the book of Revelation and say, well, that happened in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century, and there's this gradual unfolding of the book of Revelation over the church age period. Futurism, which is the one that I adhere to, and most Pentecostals and charismatics hold to, say that the majority of the prophecies in Revelation, Daniel, Matthew 24, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, are going to happen in the future. Most of it is future. There's going to be a future tribulation, and the Antichrist is a future figure. So there's just a little bit of an overview. Preterism says prophecies fulfilled before 70 AD, including the coming of Christ. Historicism says it's gradually fulfilled over history. Futurism says the majority of prophecy will be fulfilled in the future. Now, how does it influence your interpretation of the Bible? Well, if we just take, for example, your understanding of the person referred to as the Antichrist or the beast or the man of sin, preterists will believe he's a Roman because we know from Daniel that he has to be linked to Rome. But they say it has to be someone in the 1st century. So they'll say it's Nero. And they'll even work out 666 and say that it's Nero, and they actually make miscalculations, which I show in my first book. But that's their claim. Historicists also believe it's got something to do with Rome, and they're correct, but then they'll say, well, it's over history, and the best fit they can find is the Pope or the papal system. And so typically when you read things, and that's what surprises me, we hear a lot of people, even in charismatic movements, talking about the Pope being the Antichrist. That's not a view that's actually consistent with futurism, because that's actually the view today that is held by the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, is they typically are historicists, and the Roman Catholic Church is blamed for everything, and effectively the Pope or the papal system is the Antichrist. A proper futurist view, again, identifies the Antichrist with Rome, but says he's a future figure and he's a political and a religious leader of a future revived Roman Empire. So preterist says he's a first century Roman emperor, Nero. Historicists say it's the papal church or the Pope in particular. The futurists say, no, someone in the future. So don't get mixed up about that. When you read in articles, if you hear them talking about Nero being the Antichrist, you know it's a preterist website. About the Pope, sometimes they just confused charismatics, but typically that's a historicist view, not a futurist view. Preterism, as I said, is of late origin. None of the early Christian writers considered the return of Jesus and the resurrection to have taken place. And in fact, it originated with a Jesuit. The Jesuits, you know, are very much linked to a lot of conspiratorial theories, and rightfully so, because it was part of what we call the Counter-Reformation, where they try to counteract the Reformation by deliberately starting wars and influencing kings to sort of, you know, try to get rid of the Protestants. But anyway, Louis de Alcazar is the first known preterist, and he deliberately took that theory to try to take the heat of the Catholic Church, because the view then was predominantly historicist. And so they were all saying the Pope is the Antichrist. So to try to get an alternative theory, he introduced preterism and said, no, it's the Roman Church. It was pagan Rome, and it was Nero. He's the bad guy, not the Pope. Preterism is generally associated with liberal scholars, and they disassociate themselves with supernatural predictive prophecy, because as I say, if you take that view, you don't have prophecy left, you have history. The biggest problem, or one of the problems, is that preterism places the return of Christ and the judgment in AD 70. So it means that is actually heretical in terms of all the early creeds, in terms of all the early church writings. All the early church writers spoke of Jesus as coming in the future. And the earliest creed that we have from the 2nd century says Jesus will come again to judge the living and the dead, speaks of it in the future. The Nicene Creed, all the creeds spoke of Jesus coming in the future. And that would have been deemed a heresy. Another problem is Paul says, whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. That's why we have communion. So if you're a preterist, why are you having communion? Because Jesus has already come. Irenaeus is, sorry, I just want to go close that door. We can get a lot of insight by reading the early writings of Christians. Irenaeus is someone I have a great lot of respect for. The reason being is there's a direct link to him and the Apostle John. The Apostle John had a disciple called Polycarp, who was actually a bishop of Smyrna, and he was martyred there. But Polycarp, in turn, had a disciple called Irenaeus. And Irenaeus, in effect, you could say he was a 2nd generation disciple of the Apostle John, who wrote the book of Revelation. Hence, his teachings, which he got from Polycarp, which Polycarp got directly from John, should tell us, things that are pretty relevant to prophecy. Now, Irenaeus says that the book of Revelation was written towards the end of Domitian's reign. And that places it in the last decade of the 1st century. So according to Irenaeus, we can date the book of Revelation to about AD 95. And that's a big problem for preterists, because preterists say that it was fulfilled in AD 70, which is 25 years early. So how could John be writing 25 years later and talking about it as being future when actually it had happened 3 decades ago? Because of that, what preterists try to do, they try early date revelation. They try to say it was written before. Doing that, they ignore all the early writings, because Irenaeus wasn't the only one. All the early writers we have say that's when the book of Revelation was written. That John was put on Patmos by Domitian. The thing is to suggest that the coming of Jesus is completely fulfilled with the destruction of the temple is ridiculous. Because if you read Luke 21, you do find a lot of, talk of Jerusalem being destroyed. And to be honest, some of that stuff was fulfilled in 70 AD, but there is clearly stuff in Luke 21 and Matthew 24 that wasn't fulfilled then, because Jesus says all the nations of the earth will mourn because they're going to see the Son of Man appear in the sky, and they're going to see him coming with his angels. Did that happen in AD 70? Well, if it did, no one knows about it. Okay, because of that, you find that some preterists admit that that's a big problem. And so they'll say, you know what, all prophecy was fulfilled except the coming of Jesus. And we call those guys partial preterists. They admit that it's an awkward one to get out of. So to them, prophecy is fulfilled except the coming of Jesus in AD 70. So you have two second comings, one in AD 70 and one in the future. Historicism, as I said, finds fulfillment throughout the church age, and they go to the visions of Revelation and they apply them to historical events. And so, for example, they look at the locusts and they'll say, oh, that's the invasions of the Muslims, in Africa and the Middle East. And, this one's the Catholics and the Antichrist is the Pope. They'll find all different symbols. But one thing that you will find in historicism, because if you read the book of Revelation, it's clearly set with two periods of 1260 days, which is 7 years. 1260 is 3.5 years. And there's another period, 1260, the two together is 7 years. So what they do is they use what they call the day-year principle. And they say, no, that day is actually a year. And so that allows them 1260 years. They normally find a starting point where they say we're going to start counting from then. And then typically what they do is the end of the 1260 years, they work out when Jesus is coming back again. And they made a lot of these calculations and always been wrong. The Seventh-day Adventists in the middle of the 19th century, all went up on the mountain, quit their jobs and were waiting for Jesus to come. And then when he didn't come, they had to go rework their calculations and, they were wrong again. And the Jehovah's Witnesses were the same. I think they had about 5 incorrect dates, including 1914, where Jesus was coming again, and he didn't arrive, so they had to keep on reworking it. And so that's the downfall of historicism, is because they use this 1260 years, and depending on when start, they end up at say Jesus has to come, and they've predicted his arrival, and they've been wrong. And Jesus said, no one knows the day or the hour, including the angels. He said, not even the incarnate Jesus knew it. He said, only the Father. And yet these guys have worked it out. And so with the 1260 years, that gives them enough time to accommodate the history of the Catholic Church and to identify the Antichrist, not as a man, typically, but as a system, or specifically the papacy. And it's got a very loose, when I say allegorical approach, it means they don't take scripture literally. Now, I understand there's sometimes, especially in Revelation, where things aren't literal, they're symbol. But the general rule is if something makes sense literally, it literally. Clearly, there's signs when it talks about a woman in the sky, standing on the, the moon and the sun and stars in her hair. We know it's an allegory. But there are things that clearly can be understood literally. By making it very allegorical, you find that they end up with a variety of interpretations. You find that historicists, you've got very many different interpretations. And then it's also extremely anti-Catholic. And to me, that's a problem in that it ignores the fact that actually we've had a lot of reform in the Catholic Church. I can understand why in the medieval times or in the time of the Reformation, people thought the Pope was the Antichrist, because he was pretty much behaving like him. And I mean, they were burning Christians at the stake. The fact is, Catholics aren't doing that anymore, and they've lost a lot of their political power. They don't have the papal states for one. At that time, they actually had, territory that they ruled over, and they lost all of it. And so the actual Vatican in that area is a very small little area, and they don't hold much political sway. So to me, to try identify the Pope as being some sort of a person who could be a political ruler who could rule the world is just something that doesn't really make much sense in the modern world. And one of the weaknesses of the system is that it links prophecy, all these signs, with Western church history. They forget the fact that we actually had a church in parts of Asia and in Africa. In fact, a lot of people forget that we actually had a church in Africa a strong church in Africa till the 7th century. People thought Christianity was brought up by the missionaries. You read the book of Acts. I mean, you had the Ethiopian eunuch right then who would have taken the gospel back to Ethiopia. And you have churches in Ethiopia and Egypt that date back to, the 1st century, the Coptic churches. What happened in the 7th century is the Muslims came and destroyed most of those churches and forcefully converted a lot of the people. And so Christianity kind of came back from the south with the missionaries, but there was a very strong church in Africa. In fact, a lot of the early church writers were from North Africa. Augustine, who was a very well-known church writer, was basically from what today is Tunisia, in a city called Carthage. Tertullian, Athanasius, all these early church writers were from Africa. So futurism became the predominant view in the 19th century. Historicism was very popular at the time of the Reformers because, bear in mind, these guys, saw the Catholic Church as, the Antichrist or the papal system because of the fact that how they've been treated, they've been burnt at the stake. When that had passed, futurism became a more predominant view, and that's a predominant view today, which, as I say, views the majority of events in Revelation, in prophecy, as being events which have not yet happened. It foresees a resurrection of the dead and a rapture of the living. We believe that there'll be a 7-year tribulation in the future, which is going to be a period of time when the Antichrist, who's a literal man, not a system, will persecute saints, and God will judge the rebellious inhabitants of the earth. And so let's have a quick look at Matthew 24. Some people say, well, why do we bother so much about prophecy? Why do we make such a fuss about it? Well, if you look at the Old Testament, you've got 5 major prophets. You've got 12 minor prophets. That's 17 books out of 39. If you go to the New Testament, you've got the book of Revelation. Some people don't realize that the book of 1 and 2 Thessalonians were written primarily to address issues about prophecy. There's 3 books there. If you look at the percentage of scripture that addresses prophecy, it's important. Why did God put so much in the Bible? Prophecy. So Matthew 24, Jesus discusses the end times with his disciples. What happened is they were walking in the temple in Jerusalem, and the disciples were very impressed with this wonderful temple that had been refurbished by Herod the Great. He was a very good builder, despite the fact that he was a very ruthless king. And they were commenting on how wonderful these massive stones are. And Jesus startles them because he said, truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. And that was fulfilled about 40 years later, AD 70, when Titus, who was the commander of the Roman armies, the future emperor, basically because of the revolt of the Jews, not only leveled Jerusalem, destroyed the temple as well. And not one stone was left on another. In fact, literally, not one stone was left on another. Because what happened is, according to Josephus, who was a first Jewish historian, a fire broke out in the temple, which Titus didn't want. And because of that, the gold and the silver and all that melted and literally ran into the rocks. And because the Roman soldiers wanted their booty, it was part of their pay, they literally took it stone by stone to try to find melted gold and silver. Not one stone will be left standing, Jesus said. Here's a picture of Jerusalem. So those of you who've been to Jerusalem will know that that's looking at Jerusalem today from the Mount of Olives. There you can see the that golden domed mosque over there, that's the region of where the temple would have been. Well, that's the Temple Mount, where the temple was. Remember, it was leveled by Titus. Al-Aqsa is a mosque. It's got a silver sort of dome, the Dome of the Rock. A lot of people believe that's where the temple is. I actually tackle that issue in my one book because there's different theories. There's the Eastern Gate. The Eastern Gate, you can see, is walled up. And that's the gate Jesus is going to enter when he returns. And it says his feet will touch the Mount of Olives, and the mountain will split in two, and he's going to come through that Eastern Gate. And that's why it's been walled up. The Muslims don't want any Jewish prophet coming through there, as if that's going to stop him. And they even put a graveyard there because they thought no Jewish prophet will go through a graveyard. Incidentally, all these are graves. Jews. They believe the Messiah, according to the scriptures, the Old Testament said he'll come on the Mount of Olives. And so they want to be at the resurrection, the first to be able to greet the Messiah. So they pay lots of dollars to be buried there. And that's where Jesus sits. And he's sitting there, and instead of looking at that horrible mosque, he was looking at the temple, and he was telling his disciples. Now, he's just told them earlier in the day, the stone will be left another. And they say to him, when will this happen? He addresses three of his disciples. There's Peter, James, and Andrew. They say, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, they're actually asking two questions, but you can see they thought it was going to happen at the same time. When will this temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So in their minds, they thought that that's what's going to happen. The temple will be destroyed, and that's when Jesus is going to come. But Jesus tells them, firstly, he gives them signs. He said there'll be many false Christs. There'll be many wars and rumors of wars. He said there'll be famines and earthquakes in various places. There'll be pestilences in various places. He speaks about persecution of believers and an increase of wickedness. And he speaks of those as being birth pangs. And he said, but the end is not, is yet to come. But then he says the gospel would be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end would come. So he first gives them things leading up to his coming, and then he says that when the gospel is preached to the whole world, then the end would come. So you get some critics of futurism, and they say, why are we looking at, earthquakes and wars and famines and all these things as signs of Jesus' return? They say there's always been, wars and famines and pestilences. Well, if that's true, then Jesus isn't answering his disciples' question, because they said, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And those were the signs he gave. Now, it's true that you've always had wars, famines, and false Christs, but Jesus spoke of them as being birth pains. And you speak to any woman, one thing they'll tell you about birth pains is that they increase in intensity as the time of the birth approaches. And that's what we see with these wars and earthquakes and famines and pestilences, is that, yes, they've always happened, but they increase in intensity. And it's one of the signs of Jesus' close coming. He said, many will come in my name, saying, I'm the Christ, that's Messiah, and will lead many astray. So Jesus says the lead up to his coming would be associated with many false messiahs and false prophets. Now that's a big problem for preterism, because you get no people after Jesus who claim to be Messiah until the 2nd century. In the 2nd century, you had a guy called Bar Kokhba who started a whole revolt against the Romans again. And that was in AD 132. But you find nobody in that time. So if preterism is right, well, then Jesus made a mistake, because he said before his coming, many are going to come and say, I'm the Christ. And you got nobody then. But let's look, and I go through all the centuries in one of my books, but let's just take the last few centuries. In the 18th century, there were 2 people that I could find who claimed to be Christ. In the 19th century, there were 8. Since the start of the 20th century, there's been 40. Birth pains, increasing in intensity. Well, that looks to me pretty much like an upward trend, wouldn't you say? You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. He says, but see to it that you're not alarmed. He says such things must happen, but is still to come. So he's saying when you hear the wars and rumors of wars, that's not the end yet. But you see the same trends with wars. True, there's always been wars. But in the 20th century, we had a period from 1914 to 1947, which was the most deadly period in the history of humanity, where between 100 to 200 million people died. Obviously, you had 2 world wars in there. And that was in a planet that then had 2 billion people. We had, just in the 20th century, besides the 2 world wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the First Gulf War. According to Associated Press, the century came to a close with 1/3 of the world's 193 nations embroiled in conflict. I don't think it's getting better. Pestilence. There will be pestilences in various places. That should resonate a bit, especially if you've got a mask over your face. Okay, during the 20th century, now again, you've had pestilences. We've had the Black Death, the bubonic plague during the Middle Ages, which, decimated Europe. We've had bad pestilences. But if you look again, since the 20th century, TB killed approximately 100 million people. In the 20th century, smallpox, it's estimated, killed 300 to 500 million people. 6 cholera pandemic, death toll 800,000. They have given the dates. The Spanish flu after World War I killed more people than the war. And it was about 100 years ago. So if we think Corona is bad, this was literally, started in 1918, 40 to 50 million people died. 40 to 50 million people died. Asian flu, 2 million. Hong Kong flu, 1 million. There's the dates. We've recently had the SARS, the H1N1, Ebola. As I mentioned, Corona, I tried to get the most recent stats. I update this. I got from the 17th of March. So far, and it's not at the end, obviously we all know that we've had 122 million cases and 2.69 million deaths, but we still got that going on, and they're predicting 3rd and 4th waves in our country. That's the worldwide picture. There will be pestilences. What about HIV? We've forgotten about that. Around 57.9 million people with HIV in 2018. I got these figures from UNAIDS, so this is not from an email or some sort of a fake news site. Since the start of the epidemic, there's been 74.9 million people infected and 32 million. It's almost half. 32 million people have died of HIV or from complications. You know what's got the worst HIV infection rate in the world? South Africa. 7.7 million people. That's 20%. That is 1 in 5 people. As I say, those are stats from the UN. 1 in 5 people in South Africa has got HIV. Second highest in the world is Zimbabwe. Southern Africa is the worst rate in the world. In fact, South Africa has got more people infected than the United States, and the United States has got 7 times our population. The prevalence is even higher among men who have sex with men, transgender women, sex workers, and people who inject drugs. And even that's not politically correct. That comes from the UN. Jesus said there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Between 2004 and 2014, there were 18 earthquakes with a magnitude of 8 or more on the Richter scale. And that's an increase of 265% over the equivalent period a century ago. Increase of 265%. Interestingly, there wasn't an increase in the earthquakes, but it was in the high magnitude earthquakes. Now, I understand that a lot of global warming and the story is a narrative that's used by globalists for their own agenda, and some of it is nonsense. But this, what I'm showing you is factual. This is from NASA. This is a plot of the 20th warmest years which have all occurred since 2001, the trend in terms of global warming. And again, you can see going up. That's from NASA. Why do I mention it? Because some scientists predict that earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, giant landslides, and tsunami are going to become more frequent as global warming changes the Earth's crust. Professor Bill Maguire of University College London told Reuters, when the ice is lost, because the more it warms, the more the ice cap melts. The Earth's crust bounces back up again, and that triggers what? Earthquakes, which triggers submarine landslides, which cause tsunamis. You notice how many tsunamis we've had in recent years. We never used to hear of them when we were younger. There again, I plotted the number of tsunamis that we know of over the centuries. I did a projection for the 21st century because obviously we've only had 20 years. So far in the 21st century, we've had 18. If you assume that rate continues, that means we'd have 90 in a century. And look at the kind of graph that you get there. That's the increase in tsunamis over the centuries. Tsunamis are caused by earthquakes, if you don't know. It's earthquake underground, underwater earthquake, which creates a tidal wave. Then Jesus said, you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. He's predicting persecution. Now you might say, oh, well, we haven't seen that. Well, if you say that, that's because you live in South Africa. Do you know that more Christians were martyred in the 20th century than in the previous 19 centuries combined? There were 45.4 million martyred in the 20th century. That's according to Dave Barrett, who's used as a source for Britannica. And yeah, if you want to get a breakdown, you know, atheists who are so tolerant of everybody and always telling Christians how intolerant we are, and yet they killed 31.6 million Christians. Muslims are the runners-up, but quite far behind, 9 million. Animists, 7.4, Buddhists, 1.6, Hindus, 676,000. The atheists and Muslims killed even more than the Papal Church in the Middle Ages. So a lot of people identify persecution with, again, you know, with the Papal Church. They are beaten by both the atheists and the Muslims in terms of the number of Christians they killed. According to the World Watch Monitor, there 4,344 Christians were killed for faith-related reasons in 2014, more than double the previous year and more than triple the year before that. Largest number of deaths are put in bold, the ones that are in Africa, because it's maybe closer home, Nigeria, Central African Republic, Syria, Kenya, North Korea. 1,062 churches were attacked in 2014. Majority of attacks were in China, Vietnam, Nigeria, Syria, and the Central African Republic. So you don't get persecuted. You don't know if anyone is being killed for their faith. That's because you live in a country where there's religious freedom. So when Jesus says, then you'll be handed over to be put to death, don't think it's not happening. It is happening. Birth pains occur before the birth. So if we look at the birth as being the coming of Christ, birth pains are leading up to the coming of Christ. It's very that there are marked parallels between Matthew 24, those signs that Jesus gave, when they said, what will be the sign of your coming? And the first 5 seals of Revelation. If you know the book of Revelation, it starts with 7 seals, and then you get the 7 trumpets, and then 7 vials. Well, those 7 seals, if you take the first 5, they correlate to what Jesus spoke about here. And I believe, like many do, that the rapture takes place at the seal in the book of Revelation. So it's interesting that the first 5 correlate to those signs, and the 6th seal is where we believe the rapture takes place. So let's have a quick look at that. Revelation 6, John sees a white horse, rider on a white horse, who we identify as the Antichrist. What did Jesus say? Many will come claiming I'm the Messiah. The next horse is, we're told, is war. Jesus said, you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. The third horse is a black horse, which represents famine. Remember, the eyes at the scales, and he's talking about the price of food. Jesus said there will be famines. The fourth horse is a pale horse, and John is told that it represents death by sword, famine, and plague, pestilence. Jesus said there will be earthquakes and plagues. Verse 9 to 10, of Revelation 6, when the fifth seal is opened, John sees the souls of martyrs under the altar. And they say, how long, O Lord, before you avenge our blood? Jesus says, then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, hated. So we find those first 5 seals correlated to what Jesus said were the signs of his coming. And the 6th seal, I believe, is the rapture. Then Jesus said, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Joshua Project's website, 2015, said that 65 million people hear the gospel for the first time every year. The gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world, Jesus said. 178,000 hear the good news today for the first time. In the last 12 months, that's at the time of these stats, 50,000 new churches started in 1 year. Evangelical Christianity is growing faster than Islam and twice as fast than Buddhism and Hinduism. But this will startle you. True Christianity has grown by more than 300 million believers in the past 10 years. 300 million. And you'll say, wow, it's good. Why aren't I meeting more Christians? 3% of those are from North America and Europe, which was the historical stronghold of Christianity. 3%, 10 million. 290 million of those who became Christians coming from countries like Nigeria, Brazil, India, China. Historically, they weren't Christian countries. In fact, the most remarkable change in the 20th century Christianity is the rapid growth of Christianity in Africa and Asia. It used to be seen as the stronghold and the religion of Europe and the Americas, but we've had this massive advance into Africa and Asia. Fastest growing church in the world is in China. The second fastest growing church is in Africa. And so the center of gravity has shifted from the West to what we call the global South. There you see the global South. It excludes Australia, includes part of Asia. Look at that. You take that first column, the percentage of Christians in Europe and North America. In 1800, 99% of Christians lived in North America and Europe. By 1900, 90%. Obviously, because a lot of the missionary work. By 1985, 50%. So already there we hit break even. But by 2010, you can see that more than 2/3 of the Christians in the world are in the global South, no longer Europe and North America. 2/3 of all Christians in the global South. Okay, so Jesus said the gospel will be preached in the whole world. It is being preached. The fact that it's in decline in Europe, which it is, you find that Europe's in decline. America, the number of Christians pretty much has stayed the same, but the quality of Christianity has gone down the drain, especially if you watch some of these televangelists. But now often people will ask, what prophetic event remains that has to happen to prevent the return of Jesus? And the only one I can think of is this. Jesus said, lastly, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. The whole world, testimony to all nations. So has the gospel been preached in the whole world? Well, those stats look pretty impressive. I mean, there's a lot happening. But by 2007, David Barrett, who I said is a guy Britannica use, he and Todd Johnson estimated the number of unreached people to 1.8 billion people. Standing shoulder to shoulder, 1.8 billion people will go around the world's equator 38 times. So this is a very approximate slide. We know that about people in the world claim to be Christians. Now, I understand that some people on a census form it's what I call the none of the above Christians, nominal Christians. They say, well, I'm not an atheist, I'm not a Muslim, I must be a Christian. Okay, none of the above. I understand that. I mean, we live in a country where almost 80% of people claim to be Christians, which should be a lot fuller if that were the case, but they claim in name to be Christians. So a third of the world claims to be Christians. 40% of the world have heard, but they either haven't responded or else they've rejected. Now, that's not our responsibility, because if they've heard and not accepted, God will hold them accountable. But that is our responsibility, because they are 30%, a third of the world, they haven't rejected Jesus. They don't know who Jesus is. And the majority of those people live in an area called the 1040 window. And so guys who study missions look at that area, which is nicknamed that because it's a rectangular area of North Africa, the Middle East and Asia between the 10 degrees north and 40 degrees north latitude. And that's where the majority of unreached people live. There's an estimated 2.91 billion individuals living there. The top 50 least evangelized megacities are all in that period. So that's a big target for missions. Yeah, one of the reasons why there's a problem, you can find that there's either false religion or no religion there. North Africa is still dominated by Islam, which is tragic because, as I say, that was originally one of the earliest strongholds of Christianity until it was destroyed in the 7th century. Fortunately, the gospel's coming up from the south, because Southern Africa, 100 years ago, beginning of the 20th century, it was something like 1 or 2% of Africa Christian, and now the largest religion in Africa is Christianity. But we've got a lot of work to do. And I'll update these stats, and I was pleased when I updated them to find there's been a big improvement. The improvement is due to the fact of computerization. I'm able to translate things a lot quicker. So according to Wycliffe Bible translators, there's still 3,945 languages with no scripture. Imagine not having the scripture in your language. Fortunately, the guys have targeted the larger languages first. Okay, but there's still 1 in 5 people waiting for the Bible in their own language. Wycliffe actually, when I read a couple of years ago, set a target that they wanted by 2026 at that time, that every single language in the world would have a portion of scripture in their own language. That was their target. They called it the Last Languages Project. I don't know if they're still on track with that, but that's quite a challenge, because that's only 5 years' time if they stick to their target. The point I'm trying to make is that we've got unfinished work. We want Jesus to come. Well, you've got some work to do. Because in Revelation 7, which is after the 6th seal, John sees the redeemed before God's throne. He says they consisted of every nation, tribe, people, and language. He didn't say most nations. He said every nation, tribe, language, people and language. And so despite Jesus' command to evangelize, still 1/3 of the world's population have never heard of his name. Oswald J. Smith said, we talk of the second coming, half the world has never heard of the first. Okay, that's a bit better since then. Now it's 1/3 of the world. But we need to up a game a bit. Can the coming of Jesus? Well, the Bible says we can. 2 Peter 3, verse 11 to 12 says, you ought to live holy and godly lives as you look forward to the day of God and speed, it's coming. gospel will be preached, the whole world, and then the end will come. Now, look, I understand as well that's not necessarily a prerequisite for the rapture, because the gospel is still proclaimed. And some people say, well, what about the two witnesses and 140,000, I'm getting tongue-tied here, 144,000, the 12 tribes of Israel who proclaim the gospel. So there is evangelization going on there, and that could even be the point where that prophecy is finally fulfilled. But let's not use it as an excuse for not doing our job. Command Jesus gave us, known as the Great Commission. He said, go into all the world, preach the gospel to all creation. He didn't say go into most of the world and preach the gospel to most creation. We've got a task to go into all the world. Now, there's been a lot of headway made there, but the task is not finished. There's enough evangelistic activity to reach the whole world. We have enough evangelistic activity for everyone in the world to hear a 1-hour presentation of the gospel every other day, all year long. Over 1.43 billion hours of evangelism generated by Christians every year. So what's the problem? The problem is it's unevenly targeted, because 91% of Christian outreach and evangelism targets other Christians. Even find with the mega churches, they start a big church, and where do they try to get their congregation? From the other churches down the road. And they tell you how the church is growing because they stole the congregation from the Baptists and the Methodists. It's not evangelism. Evangelism is going to those who've never heard the gospel. Jesus said we're to be fishers of men. He didn't say we must move the fish in the aquarium from one to another. Which countries received the most missionaries in 2010? Well, you've seen that 1041. So that should be the area we should target. Which is the country that really needs missionaries? And you know where we sent the most missionaries in 2010? To the United States, which is the country that's got the most Christians in the world. And then to Brazil, which Brazil, the Pentecostal growth is higher than the birth rate. And you can see South Africa is number 5. South Africa received 12,000 missionaries, and yet we've got 80% of our people who claim to be Christians. I like the fact India wasn't there, because India is in the 1040 window, but we need to be more wise in the way that we target our evangelism. I'll take questions at the end of the session.
Yeah, okay.
Let me just quickly get through this. And so 95% of Christian workers focus on their own people. And so let's just look at that graph there. Remember I told you about 33% of the world is people who claim to be Christians, and that's where we send 80% of our missionaries. 27% are the least evangelized, and that's where we send 2.5% of our missionaries. Now, I'm giving you a bit of a simplistic picture, because sometimes it's not just because we don't want to send missionaries there. Sometimes you can't send missionaries there. So if you say, I want to go to North Korea, and you put there, I'm coming as a missionary, you won't get into the country. Okay, so I understand there are complications, but that aside, there are different ways of evangelizing that we need to look at. But, and there are complexities, and some of it is due to political systems now that restrict, we support people in restricted countries, and I won't mention them because this obviously goes onto the internet, but one guy that we support who stays in one of these nations in the 1040 window, he has to go into the country as a teacher. That's what he's there officially, but he's actually a missionary, because if he said a missionary, he wouldn't be allowed in the country. And so let's go to the Great Tribulation. Preterists will tell you that the Great Tribulation's got nothing to do with the future Antichrist. They say that the tribulation was in the 1st century, and they identify it with the events around the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Question is, then why did all the early church writers, go read them, still speak about the Antichrist and the abomination of desolation as being in the future? No one, you won't find any of the early writers said that it all happened in the 1st century. So I want to tell you that identifying the tribulation Matthew 24 with the 1260-day rule of the Antichrist is not something that's been invented by modern prophecy teachers. I've heard people say that it was made up by them because they want to make money to sell books. I can show you it been taught by Irenaeus, who was a second generation disciple of John in the 2nd century, and by plenty of other early church writers. Irenaeus, he has one quote. This is the 2nd century. It says, and therefore, when in the end, the church shall be suddenly caught up. Church being caught up, that's rapture. From this, it is said, there shall be tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning. He speaks about a future catching up with the church, and he speaks about a future tribulation. It doesn't say it happened in the last century. The Shepherd of Hermas, which was written in the late 1st or mid-2nd century, says, go therefore and tell the elect of the Lord, and say to them that this beast is a type of the great tribulation that is coming. Bev, why don't you just check? I think there's someone who's unmuted. Thanks. Jesus said there'll be a great tribulation. That's where we get the term the great tribulation. It's not used in Revelation, but in Revelation we've got 2 periods of 1260 days. This great tribulation, some people say, well, that was, the 1st century. But Jesus said, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. He said there'll be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world. And he says, and never to be equaled again. So that's a problem, because if you're preterists, you're saying the Great Tribulation happened in AD 70, and it was the greatest distress, never to be equaled again. Now, according to Josephus, as I said, he was a 1st century Jewish historian. He was an eyewitness to the destruction of Jerusalem because he was friends with Titus. Even though he was a Jew, he realized that the Jewish cause was hopeless and he defected to the Romans, and he was trying to reason with these people. That's why they had him at Jerusalem, but they wouldn't listen to him. And he wrote a history afterwards to try sort of get favor in his people's eyes again, because a lot of them regarded him as a turncoat. But he was witness, and he says that the Jewish casualties when they destroyed Jerusalem was 1.1 million. He talks about the blood running in the gutters. They killed so many people. Now, the Roman historian Tacitus gives a more conservative figure. He says 600,000. So that's bad. But Hitler killed 6 million Jews. So if that was the Great Tribulation, never to be equaled again, well, Hitler not only equaled it, he multiplied it by 6. So how could that have been the Great Tribulation? If the prophecy was fulfilled in AD 70, how can Jesus say that the distress would never be equaled again? So you can't justify preterist claims purely on the basis of the Holocaust, which happened in the 20th century. Consider the futurist claim. The futurist claim says that the Great Tribulation is in the future. According to Zechariah, it talks about Jesus coming back, the Messiah coming on the Mount of Olives in Zechariah 14. And before that, it says in the whole land, that's Israel, 2/3 will be struck down and perish. So Zechariah speaks about 2/3 of Jews being killed, which we believe will be by the Antichrist. And in 2012, the figures I got for the Jewish population worldwide was almost 14 million. 2/3 of that is 9 million. So if the Antichrist were to come in our day and were to kill 2/3, that beats the Holocaust. What happened in AD 70 didn't beat the Holocaust. So that's actually quite a frightening thing, that the Bible prophesies, destruction of the Jewish people by the Antichrist that is worse than what Hitler did. There were prophecies about people seeing Jesus in the sky, and as I said, then the angels, and everybody knows it didn't happen in AD 70. Now, no matter how creative you get. It talks about the sun being darkened and the moon not giving its light and the stars falling to earth. Didn't happen in AD 70, but if you go read Revelation, the 6th seal, that's exactly what it says. It says the 6th seal was open and the sun was darkened, the moon, basically did not give light and the stars fell. Preterists try to use the statement by Jesus when he gave that Olivet discourse in Matthew 24 to support their claims. They say, he said, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. And so they say, we'll see. He said it was going to happen in their generation, and therefore AD 70 was within their generation, and so it had to be fulfilled then. But that word that's translated generation can quite legitimately be translated as race. And so I believe it's actually a reference to the Jewish people, that Jesus was saying that the Jewish people would not be destroyed, and that's not through lack of trying. The Romans tried to destroy them. We've not only had it, you go right through history, you had the Russian pogroms in Europe, you find there were mass destructions during the Crusades of Jews. This race would not be destroyed. And that's not a modern opinion. It was mentioned by Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin in the 5th century. And this is what he wrote in the 5th century. He said, by generation, Jesus means the whole human race and the Jews in particular. So he's not talking about the fact that it's going to happen within the lifespan of the people he's talking to. And so the final section, the abomination of desolation. If you're a preterist, they say the abomination is either a statue of Caligula or apostate Judaism, because they say Jesus had paid the price for the sin, so the priest coming into the holy place for the next 40 years was an abomination of desolation. The most common view is they say it was Titus when he entered the temple, which they destroyed in 70 AD, and that's what the abomination was. Because remember, Jesus said, that when you see standing in the holy place the abomination of desolation, then flee. The historicists, remember, they viewed the fulfillment of prophecy over the entire church period. So they said the abomination, well, that's the Pope, and it's not the temple, it's the spiritual temple, which is the church. And the fact that he's got dominion there, that's an abomination. Others say, well, it's the Islamic Dome of the Rock, they put up there that occupies the place of the temple. Now, I agree, it is an abomination, but it's not the abomination of desolation. Futurists say that when he speaks about the abomination, it's talking about a future defiling of the temple by the Antichrist that we read of in the book of Revelation. Jesus said, so when you see standing in the holy place, that's referring to the temple, the abomination that causes desolation. Now, preachers say, Jesus said, so when you see. So he was actually addressing his disciples, and he was saying that they would see it, and therefore that was fulfilled when Titus went into the temple in AD 70, because he said, when you see. Is that a valid argument? If you take that to an extreme, and let's apply to other things Jesus said, that he said, when you're speaking only to the people he was addressing. Jesus said, when you give to the needy, then I can say, well, look, he was only talking to his disciples, so I don't give the needy, that's only the 12. Jesus said, when you're persecuted, saying only the 12 will be persecuted. Well, tell that to all the people who've been killed for their faith today. Jesus said, when you pray, forgive them. So that means that only the disciples of Jesus in the first century had to pray and forgive people. When you, obviously he's addressing the immediate audience, but we all know that he's addressing Christians of all ages. That's just the way it works. The other thing is Jesus was speaking to 4 people. He was speaking to Peter, Andrew, James, John. In AD 70, 3 of those 4 were already dead. They were killed. James killed, read the book of Acts. Herod beheaded him. Peter, already Nero had crucified him upside down. Andrew was crucified on a X-shaped cross. Only one who was alive when the temple was destroyed was John, and he wasn't in Jerusalem. So Jesus can't say, well, when you see, because none of those 4 saw it. When he's saying when you, he's talking about a future generation. So you mustn't listen to silly arguments like that. Now, Jesus is obviously referring to Daniel's prophecies because Daniel speaks about a prince who is to come. We know that that prince is somehow linked to the Romans because he talks about the prince of the people who destroy the city, and the people who destroyed the city were the Romans. He talks about him establishing a treaty, a covenant for 7 years, and he says in the middle of the 7, that's 3.5 years through, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And of a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. Talking about a future Roman ruler who desecrates the temple halfway through a 7-year period. Daniel says that his armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. That's what Jesus was referring to. He said, when you see standing in the holy place, the nation that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Why must they flee? Because Antichrist kills 2/3 of the Jews when they realize he's not the Christ, because he's telling them to bow down to an image, and they know that their law says you don't bow down to a graven image. At the same time, the daily sacrifice is stopped. Paul refutes a heresy that the Thessalonians encountered, that the day of the Lord had already come, and he makes it clear that it would not occur until the Antichrist proclaims himself God in the temple. This is what Paul writes, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him. That's, when we gather to the Lord. We ask you, brothers, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by some prophecy, report, or letter supposed to have come from us, saying that the day of the Lord has already come. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness, that's the Antichrist, is revealed. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. Paul is writing about the event that we identify with the abomination of desolation. He's speaking about a man of lawlessness who sets himself up in God's temple and says, I'm God. And since the earliest Christian writings, they identified that and they equated it with the abomination of desolation. Future Antichrist sits in the temple. It cannot be a reference to the first century temple. The temple was destroyed by the Romans. So that tells me as well, another prophecy that has to be fulfilled, but it doesn't have to happen before the rapture, is that the temple needs to be rebuilt. How can the Antichrist create the temple when there is no temple there? There's that horrid mosque. Okay. And so we know that the temple has to be rebuilt. And that's a whole topic all on its own. And again, in my third book, I've gone into great detail as to where we believe it could be rebuilt. And there are already Jewish organizations lobbying to rebuild the temple. The temple has to be there. It says, yes, he abolishes sacrifice. There is no sacrifice there. The temple has to be built. The sacrifice has to be reinstituted. One of them is the Temple Institute. They're already training the priests, the Cohens, to do the sacrifices. They've got all the stuff ready. They're just waiting for the building. And so we equate what Daniel said, abomination of desolation, to what Jesus said about the abomination of desolation, to what Paul said about the man of lawlessness declaring himself God to be in the temple, to what John says in Revelation 13. He speaks of 3 beasts. If you include the dragon is the beast of the sky, that's Satan. Then there's a beast that comes out of the earth, which is the Antichrist. The sea, which is the Antichrist. The beast that comes out of the earth is the false prophet. Speaking of the false prophet, he says that it ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded, that's the Antichrist, by the sword and yet lived. So that's why some people believe the Antichrist will survive an assassination or maybe try and mimic Jesus' resurrection. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. So all of these things are talking about the same event, which is a future event. It's the abomination of Matthew 24. And so here's my final slide. If I tie up Revelation with Matthew 24, some of Matthew 24 and Luke 21, which is the equivalent passage, is speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And so when Jesus says not one stone will be left on another, that happened in AD 70. But there's clearly things he's speaking about then that didn't happen. And we have the 7 church ages in the book of Revelation, which I believe we in the 7th age, the Laodicean age, which Jesus referred to as the time of the Gentiles. In Luke 21, he said, Jerusalem will be trodden underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is complete. Jerusalem is no longer trodden underfoot by the Gentiles. In 1967, Jerusalem was taken back by Israel. We have the 7 seals, and I've already shown you how those first 5 parallel what Jesus said would be the birth pangs. But the end is yet to come. And then the 6th seal, I placed the rapture. Then you have the 7 trumpets. And then you find that the 7 trumpets correlate to a period of 1,260 days. It's 3.5 years. God judges the earth. Then in the middle, Antichrist breaks the treaty, sets up his image in the temple. You have the abomination of desolation. That's when Jesus says to the Jews, when you see that, flee, run to the mountains. And that's when he says there'll be great tribulation, such as never been seen, never to be repeated again. And then you get the 7 bowl judgments, which happens during that period we call the Great Tribulation. And then you'll get the Son of Man, the Son of the Son of Man in heaven coming, not as Savior, but as Judge. And we'll have a look next week at the rapture and why I believe it is before the tribulation, not afterwards.